The summer heat clung to the air, thick and unrelenting. As I stepped out of the cab and onto the gravel driveway of my uncle's countryside home. The house, nestled between towering oak trees, had always been a place of familiarity, a retreat from the chaos of city life. But this time something felt different. I had arrived later than the rest of the family. Most had come and gone, leaving only a few relatives behind. Inside, laughter and the murmur of conversation drifted through the open windows. As I walked up the porch steps, the front door creaked open before I could knock. Standing there, framed by the soft glow of the evening light, was her, my cousin, Aisha. We hadn't seen each other in years, not since childhood summers spent chasing fireflies and sneaking sweets from the kitchen. Now, she was no longer the awkward, wide-eyed girl I remembered. There was something different about her, something I couldn't quite place. "You're finally here," she said, a smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "I was beginning to think you weren't coming. I almost didn't," I admitted, adjusting the strap of my bag. "But Uncle insisted." She stepped aside, letting me in. The house felt quieter than I had expected. The dining table, usually overflowing with relatives, held only a few scattered plates. "Where is everyone?" I asked. "They left this morning," she said, leading me into the living room. "It's just me for the weekend, just her. Alone." I nodded, trying to ignore the sudden awareness that settled in my chest. She gestured toward the couch. "Sit. I'll get you something to drink." As she disappeared into the kitchen, I took in my surroundings. The house hadn't changed much. Same wooden floors, same floral curtains swaying in the breeze. And yet, the air felt charged with something unfamiliar. When she returned, she handed me a glass of iced tea and sat across from me, tucking her legs beneath her. "So tell me, how's life?" I hesitated before answering. "Busy. Work, responsibilities, the usual." She smiled knowingly. "You always were the serious one. And you?" I asked, watching her closely. A shadow flickered across her face. Same old, but there was something in her tone, something unspoken. We talked for hours, falling into the easy rhythm of nostalgia. We laughed over childhood antics, reminisced about secret forts and whispered secrets. As the sun dipped lower, the room was bathed in golden light, wrapping us in its quiet warmth. Then there was a pause, a moment where silence settled between us, thick with things neither of us dared to say. Her gaze met mine, and for a second, I felt it. An unspoken shift, a quiet gravity pulling us closer. I swallowed hard, forcing a chuckle. "Feels strange, doesn't it? How much things change." She nodded but said nothing. The moment stretched, fragile and fleeting, before she looked away. "Let's go outside," she said suddenly. "The fireflies should be out by now." I exhaled, pushing away the thoughts threatening to surface. "Yeah," I murmured, rising to my feet. "Let's go." The night air was cooler now, laced with the distant hum of crickets. Aisha led the way to the backyard, her bare feet silent against the damp grass. Fireflies flickered in the distance, their glow weaving through the darkness like fleeting whispers. We stood there for a while, letting the silence settle around us. It wasn't uncomfortable, not yet. If anything, it felt like the calm before something inevitable. "You remember how we used to catch them?" she asked, glancing at me over her shoulder. I nodded, a smirk playing on my lips. "You always let them go too soon. They weren't meant to be trapped," she murmured. Something in the way she said it made my chest tighten. She turned to face me, her expression unreadable. "You've changed." "So have you," I admitted. Her eyes searched mine, as if looking for something familiar, something she recognized from the past. A slow breeze lifted the hem of her dress, and she shivered, rubbing her arms. Without thinking, I stepped closer. "Cold?" I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. She shook her head, but she didn't move away. The space between us felt dangerously small. My pulse thrummed in my ears, a silent warning I was already ignoring. "This feels different," she whispered. I swallowed hard. "I know." And then, before I could stop myself, I reached out. My fingers brushed against her wrist, the warmth of her skin sending an undeniable current through me. She inhaled sharply but didn't pull away. A slow, inevitable gravity pulled us together. I knew the weight of what I was doing, the consequences waiting just beyond this moment. And yet, nothing in me wanted to stop. Her gaze dropped to my lips, hesitation flickering in her expression. "This is wrong," she said, but it lacked conviction. I should have agreed. I should have stepped back. But instead, I tilted my head slightly, my fingers trailing up her arm. "Tell me to stop," I murmured. She didn't. The world outside our bubble blurred. The fireflies, the trees, the night itself. All that existed was this stolen moment, teetering between restraint and surrender. Then, as if surrendering to something greater than either of us, she closed the distance. The kiss was slow, hesitant at first, like testing the weight of something fragile. But as soon as our lips met, restraint unraveled. The taste of iced tea and summer heat lingered between us. For a fleeting second, I let myself believe this could be simple, that we could exist in this moment without the shadow of consequence looming over us. But the moment ended too soon. A sound, a distant creak, maybe a door, shattered the illusion. We broke apart, breathless, as reality came crashing back. She looked at me, wide-eyed, lips still parted as if caught between words she couldn't bring herself to say. I exhaled sharply, running a hand through my hair. "Aisha, we don't," she interrupted, her voice barely above a whisper. The weight of what we had just done hung heavy between us. In the distance, the fireflies continued their quiet dance, oblivious to the storm we had just unleashed. Sleep never came easily that night. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying every second of what had happened between Aisha and me. The warmth of her lips, the way she had looked at me in the dim glow of fireflies. It was all seared into my mind, refusing to fade. But beneath the lingering heat, something colder crept in. Guilt. I turned onto my side, shutting my eyes, but the weight of my own conscience pressed heavily against my chest. I had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, and the worst part was, I wasn't sure I regretted it. Morning arrived with an unsettling stillness. The house, once comforting in its familiarity, now felt suffocating. I could hear Aisha moving around downstairs, her soft footsteps echoing through the quiet. For a moment, I considered staying in bed, avoiding the inevitable conversation. But that would only make things worse. When I finally made my way to the kitchen, she was standing by the window, a cup of tea cradled in her hands. She didn't turn when I entered, but I could see the tension in her shoulders. "Morning," I said, my voice rough from lack of sleep. She took a slow sip of her tea before answering. "Morning." The air between us felt different now, charged yet restrained. I moved to pour myself a cup, my hands steadier than I expected. "Last night—" "We don't have to talk about it," she interrupted, her tone carefully neutral. I frowned, setting the cup down with more force than necessary. "Aisha, we can't just pretend it didn't happen." She finally turned to face me, her expression unreadable. "What do you want me to say? That it was a mistake? That I regret it?" Her words hit harder than I expected. I wanted to believe it hadn't been a mistake, that what we shared in that fleeting moment had been real. But reality wasn't kind to people like us. She sighed, running a hand through her hair. "We both know this isn't something we can keep doing." I nodded, even though every part of me resisted the truth. "I know." But knowing and accepting were two very different things. The rest of the day passed in strained silence. We moved around each other like strangers, careful not to touch, not to linger. The tension between us was unbearable. One wrong move, one slip, and we'd be right back where we started. By the time the sun dipped behind the trees, I found myself standing outside, hoping the night air would clear my thoughts. Aisha joined me a few moments later, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the horizon. "This is going to eat at us, isn't it?" she murmured. I glanced at her, my chest tightening. "Maybe." She let out a quiet laugh, but there was no humor in it. "You know, for a second, I thought." She trailed off, shaking her head. I wanted to ask what she had thought, if she had believed, even for a moment, that this could end any other way. But I didn't, because I already knew the answer. In the distance, the fireflies appeared once more, flickering like tiny echoes of a past that could never be rewritten. The next morning, the world felt heavier, as if it had shifted in ways only Aisha and I could perceive. The house was the same, wooden floors creaking under soft footsteps, the scent of tea lingering in the air, but everything between us had changed irreversibly. I found her outside, sitting on the porch steps, staring at nothing in particular. The golden light of dawn painted her in hues of warmth, but there was a chill in the way she held herself. Arms wrapped around her knees, shoulders drawn inward. She heard me approach but didn't turn. "You're leaving today, right?" I hesitated. "Yeah." A long silence stretched between us. The unspoken truth hung there, dense and suffocating. Last night had only reinforced what we already knew. This was unsustainable, an illusion doomed to collapse under its own weight. Aisha exhaled, a slow, measured breath. "I wish we hadn't done this." The words sliced through me, sharper than I expected. "Do you really mean that?" I asked, my voice quieter now. She finally looked at me, and in her eyes, I saw everything. Longing, regret, something fragile that had already begun to crack. "I don't know," she admitted. "Maybe I just wish it didn't have to be this way." I sat beside her, close enough to feel the warmth of her skin but careful not to touch. "We can't change what happened." "No," she agreed, "but we can choose what happens next." A lump formed in my throat. I wanted to believe there was another way, that we could rewrite the rules, carve out something that existed outside of consequence. But that was a fantasy, and we weren't children playing make-believe anymore. Before I could speak, the sound of tires crunching against gravel broke the stillness. Aisha stiffened. I turned to see a car pulling up, the sight of it sending a sharp jolt through my chest. My fiancé stepped out. I hadn't told Aisha she was coming. I hadn't told her about her at all. Aisha's expression didn't change, but I saw the realization hit, slow, then all at once. Her breath caught, her fingers curling into fists against her lap. I opened my mouth, but what excuse could I possibly offer? Aisha stood abruptly, smoothing down her dress with trembling hands. "You should go," she said, voice devoid of emotion. I wanted to say something, anything, to lessen the weight of this moment. But no words came. By the time I forced myself to move, my fiancé was already smiling at me, oblivious to the storm raging beneath my skin. I walked toward her, every step feeling heavier, more unnatural. Behind me, Aisha remained rooted to the porch, watching, silent. As I reached for my fiancé's hand, something inside me twisted. A sharp, cruel reminder of the choice I had already made. I dared one last glance back. Aisha wasn't looking at me anymore. Her gaze was fixed on the horizon, where the sun was rising over a world that would move on without us. And just like that, it was over.